Senator the Honorable Fazal Karim, Minister of Tertiary Education and Skills Training, Senator the Honorable Larry Hawaii, Minister of Finance and Economy, Professor Henry Etzkowitz, our featured speaker, all other protocols observed, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Let me, on behalf of our Board of Governors, welcome all of you and thank you for being here this morning at this symposium. I was told that only our table had the Blue Waters bottled water with the UTT logo. So I was asked to bring up one here to show it to you, an example of what we are attempting to do. Anyhow, let me get on with my introduction of Professor Etzkowitz. We're glad to have had those presentations, of course, from two critical ministers, the Minister of the Finance Minister, who has a significant role in stimulating the economy, and of course, Minister Karim. And we are talking this morning about the connection of academia, government, and business. I see Catherine here and all of the others who are here from those various sectors. A good workman considers his tools and utilizes them to his highest potential. Indeed, we would laugh, or maybe even pity the man who seeks to dig a hole in the ground using a spoon when a shovel is available to him. It would be even more outrageous if a machine designed for that specific purpose stood nearby, ready to be used but untouched, while the man struggles to complete his seemingly endless task. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that we have many resources available at our fingertips, resources that can assist us in positively influencing the way in which we do things. And this, to a certain extent, is what the University of Trinidad and Tobago is attempting to do. It's our response, as you see from the title of today's symposium, to what we understand to be, of course, a major concern of all of us. It's not a local concern, it's a global one. Indeed, the chairman of the Gallup organization, in a book called The Common Jobs War, argues that the number one problem the world over today is the creation of jobs. While there are no jobs to be found, probably it could be restated, helping people to sustain themselves, to find a livelihood. Because the truth of the matter is that there are not enough jobs for everyone to find. And so we at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, when I took over the chair of the Board of Governors, and I looked at the mission of the University of Trinidad and Tobago, it talks about UTT being an entrepreneurial university, spawning entrepreneurs and developing entrepreneurship, and giving birth to new companies and new organizations. So I started to look at what was this concept of the entrepreneurial university. As we all know, and we've heard before, universities have always played a critical role in the socio-economic development of their various societies. But as I started to look at it, and that's why I came across Professor Etzkowitz's work, I realized that the concept of the entrepreneurial university is a specific kind of university. And universities hold fast to their traditions. We know that in many industries, the telecommunication industry, communications, travel, banking, and Senator Hawaii here, have transformed themselves. They are very, very different to what we knew them to be only recently. And so this discussion about the entrepreneurial university is really about how we deepen that process. And as Minister rightly said, not just talking about it, but making it happen, moving from talk to action. This is the start of the new academic year. And we have taken steps to put in place the organizational infrastructure to make that happen over the next coming year and in the years going forward. And so hence the reason for inviting Professor Etzkowitz, who over the last 30 or 40 years has been researching and studying and writing and acting on this concept of the Entrepreneurial University. As you have heard before, he's the author of several significant works on the Entrepreneurial University, and in fact is the president of the Triple Helix Association, that coming together of government, academia, and business. MIT and the Rise of Entrepreneurial Science, and he's co-author of Universities and the Commercialization of Knowledge, New Dimensions for the 21st Century. So we've been talking at UTT about going beyond graduating students and getting involved in the development of that entrepreneurial mindset throughout Trinidad and Tobago. I think it's probably true to say that the vast majority of our graduating students, their mindset is to look for a job rather than think about how they can create employment. And we fully understand that that's a huge task. I heard the minister on television this morning talking about balancing the budget, and it's going to be a long-term process. We fully understand that this is not going to be a one-year process. So Professor Etzkowitz's presentation here this morning and the next couple days that we spend talking, yes, Minister, and thinking and moving towards action is our attempt to engage in this process and to address this national situation. So without any further ado, let me welcome as well Professor Etzkowitz to the shores of Trinidad and Tobago. This is his very first visit. We welcome him, and we look forward to learning from him and to working together with him. Professor Henry Etzkowitz. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of university, industry, government, and civil society in Trinidad and Tobago. It's my pleasure to be with you this morning and to talk about the Entrepreneurial University in the Triple Helix. I was, about a month ago, in Indonesia for the 10th Triple Helix Conference, sponsored by the Ministry of Science and Technology of Indonesia and the Bandung Institute of Technology. Indonesia has developed its own version of the Triple Helix that they call ABG, for University, Industry, Government. In their language, Anak Baru Gede. So it's a concept that is implicit in the very nature of the university. It is, I argue, an organic development that's a latest culmination of academic development and transformation, and carries forward the key traditional missions of the university for teaching and research into its next level. There's even in teaching, which was the origins of the medieval university, to pass on and bring back the knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome, the university developed the seeds of research. In order to pass on that knowledge, one had to figure out what it was. Much of it had been lost. And so philological research was invented in order to allow teaching to take place. And so the research mission of the university grew out of its original teaching mission. And similarly, the entrepreneurial mission grew out of the research and teaching mission. Science had an independent development outside of the university. In clubs and societies like the societies that were formed in Italy in the 16th century and the Royal Society in England. It wasn't until the invention of secure methodologies in organic chemistry in the 19th century that science, experimental science, was brought into the university. And the teaching laboratory was invented at the University of Gießen in Germany. It was organized in a former military barracks on the outskirts of the university because research wasn't yet thought to be a fundamental part of the university's mission. But it was set up much the same way as we would see a teaching laboratory today. Rows of benches and hoods, a professor surrounded by assistants guiding the students in the conduct of their investigations into the nature of the substances that they were being given to analyze. And as they ran out of existing substances to train the students with, they began to give out materials which hadn't been analyzed previously. And so new knowledge was created. And it happened as they investigated the properties of some of these substances, they were found to have useful properties. And so Professor Liebig, the originator of the laboratory, began to think of putting these substances into use. And so began some of the first examples of entrepreneurship coming out of the research mission of the university. Today, if you go to some of the older pharmacies in Europe, you'll find for sale Liebig's extract, the product still being produced. Today, we would call it a health supplement or health food. There was another product that came out of Professor Liebig's laboratory, a fertilizer based on metallic substances and on his theory of fertilizers. In this instance, the theory was incorrect. The firm failed. The fertilizer did not work. The farmers rejected it. Still something that can happen to this day. And so failure is a part of entrepreneurship. Not everything will be successful. The important thing is to try, not to be too concerned about the possibility of failure. It's sometimes said that failure is celebrated in Silicon Valley. Well, not so really. People, of course, are more interested in success. But it is realized that failure can be part of the road to success. Because your first or even second venture or attempt may not work, whether it's in entrepreneurship or research or teaching. And so we come back and try again. I recall, for example, my experience as a teacher in New York in an arts-based university, where I developed many of my ideas on the Entrepreneurship University, and I was more or less an anomaly in that setting. But one day, I had a visitor from Scandinavia, a good colleague, Professor Magnus Klofsten, a professor of entrepreneurship. And he was talking to my students about the business plan and about setting up firms. And it was clear to me that the students didn't have a clue as to what he was talking about. And so I stopped the class. We took a break. And then when we came back, I asked them, who among you has considered forming a new business, a dance troupe, a theater group? These were arts and humanities students and social science students. 2/3 of the students raised their hand. 2/3 wanted to be an entrepreneur without having any idea of what the term meant. And the university itself, without realizing it, was organized on an entrepreneurial model in the arts. The theater students, as they entered, were grouped together as theater groups, and the dance students as dance troupes. And they went through their 4 years of training as a group. And sometimes when they graduated from this suburban school, they would move into downtown Lower Manhattan and take their group with them and then start as an independent dance troupe or theater group. Their university teaching was based on an incubation model of a group taken in, mentored, and coached, and then sent out into the world. The university was acting as an incubator, even though this university had never heard the term and wouldn't know what it meant if you told the arts professors that that was what they were doing, which is something I occasionally introduced to them. And so here was an implicit entrepreneurial university, the State University of New York at Purchase, which to this day doesn't realize really what its mission is. But that is what it has been doing. And so the Entrepreneurial University can start on a variety of bases. It can start from a research base. Oxford and Cambridge in the UK have turned out to be the leading entrepreneurial universities, simply because of the intellectual firepower of those universities. Once it's encouraged to move in the direction of mining the practical potential of that research, they very quickly move to the forefront. But an entrepreneurial university can also begin on a teaching base by introducing entrepreneurship into the curriculum, but not only as a course, but also as an experiential process of student groups being organized as student firms, as often happens in Brazil, where entrepreneurship has been made a part of the general education of all students at some Brazilian private, church-related, and public universities. I like to joke with my colleagues at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro that by including the theology students in entrepreneurship courses, you might get some results that you're not looking for. Perhaps they'll come up with new religions as a result of their entrepreneurial training. But it was at a conference, well, really a graduation ceremony at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. The rector made a speech about realizing dreams. A representative of each firm came forward who was completing 2 to 3 years in the university's incubator to say what they had learned in those 2 or 3 years. It was then that I realized that the incubator was not just part of the new economic and social development mission of the university, the so-called third mission, as it's often called. It was part of the original teaching mission of the university. And what was the incubator teaching? It was teaching a group of people to work together as an organization. And so in addition to teaching individuals in classrooms or seminar rooms, the university was also teaching people to form and work together as organizations. And this explained to me a phenomenon that I've been trying to figure out for several years, which was why was incubation spreading so much faster in Brazil than in the United States, where the concept was invented. Out of the aircraft industry, the skunk works, to move R&D that wasn't accepted in the main line of the firm into some place outside where it could have its own space. And then it was moved from California to the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where it became a method for helping faculty members form high-tech firms. And it was imported to Brazil from RPI by students who were trained in the management of technology and came back home, and who were active in the movement for democracy against the military regime. And once that movement, which was often led by people from the universities in Brazil, once that movement had succeeded, they then asked, how can we apply our knowledge and skills to developing our country? And so they began with the incubator model and applied that to developing high-tech firms. But at that time, 40 years ago, the base for high-tech development in Brazil was relatively small. But they soon found other uses for the incubator, not only from the university, but industry associations started forming incubators in order to start new firms in mid-tech areas. Municipalities organized incubators. In the 1930s, every town in Brazil wanted to have a fountain in the town square. By the 1980s, every town wanted an incubator. And incubators then were being used to train firms in traditional clusters to expand them. And then, in a joint project between a social movement, the Campaign Against Hunger, and the technological incubator at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, they formulated a model for establishing what came to be called the Popular Cooperative, an incubator that trained poor people from the favelas who were not literate, but trained them how to organize a cooperative to create their own jobs, first in services provided to the university and hospitals, and then in other areas. And this model that was invented bottom up was then translated into a national program by the government of Brazil. So now popular cooperatives are spread across the country. But the answer to the question of why incubators were spreading faster in Brazil than the United States was simply this. In Brazil, they realized the broader potential of the incubator, that it could be used not only for helping to start high-tech firms, which was the model in the States, but it was essentially a model for training people to work together as an organization. And so therefore, it could be applied not only to high-tech, but to mid-tech, to low-tech, to no-tech, to the arts, to community development. So there are incubators spread across Brazil in all of these areas. And that is the reason why incubation is a faster growing phenomenon in Brazil than in the United States. They adapted the model to meet the needs of their country and broadened it and expanded it. And that's also why the Brazilian Incubator Association then won a competition against American organizations to become the model for incubator development in the world. So, the triple helix. The triple helix thesis is that the university plays a key role in knowledge-based economic development. It's the leading member of the triple helix. And why is that? The comparative and competitive advantage of the university over all other institutions. Firms have research units, but typically people work there for a long period of time, and governments has research institutes. The advantage of the university is that the university has the students. Each year, we admit new students, and each year we graduate the old ones. There's a continual flow-through, a bringing in of new ideas and sending out of trained people with new ideas into the larger society. It's this flow-through of people and ideas that potentially makes the university the most creative organization. It's built into its very DNA. Even though we like our students, we may want to keep them on to work with us longer, we have to let them go and send them out to fertilize the rest of society. And so that's my argument as to why the university plays the leading role in triple helix interactions. And it becomes a more important institution in society as we move from an agricultural to an industrial to a knowledge-based society. Heretofore, the university played a secondary role in providing trained persons to staff the institutions of government and industry. But now, as we move to a knowledge-based society, the university plays an enhanced role, not only in providing trained persons, but in providing new organizations, new technologies, new ideas become the basis of future economic and social development. And so the university moves then from a secondary supporting institution to this new role on equal level with the major institutions of modern society from the 18th century. And so the university becomes part of this triple helix with industry and government. Also in the triple helix model is the concept that in addition to playing their traditional roles, university, industry, and government also have the potential to take the role of the other. If one element of the triple helix is weak or non-existent, another element can take its role. And so if the university is weak in an area of great importance to a country, companies might develop their training and research facilities to a higher level to take that role of the university until the university catches up. And similarly, if in a region government is weak, the university may come forth and play the leading role in convening the leading actors in a region to come together and figure out what the course of development should be. So in addition to playing their traditional role, each has the capacity to take the role of the other. And so if there's an absence of venture capital funding from the private sector, government may take the lead in forming organizations to provide public venture capital and incentivize a private venture capital industry. This was how a venture capital industry was created in Israel, the YASMA program, government providing half the funds, incentivizing the private sector to put in the other half with that incentive. And then at the Triple Helix Conference in the year 2000, which was held in Rio de Janeiro, the Brazilian Development Agency invited representatives of the YASMA program from Brazil to Brazil, where they had meetings off to the side of the conference and worked out how to introduce this model to Brazil. And when they introduced it, they also again adapted the model to make it work locally, because they realized that the entrepreneurs in Brazil didn't have familiarity with how to make presentations to attract venture capital. And so FINEP, the National Development Agency, set up what they called FINEP University. Basically, they had people from the agency go around the country, organize meetings and training programs to teach the entrepreneurs how to make a pitch, how to present their ideas in a format that could attract investment. They recognized that that was the missing element, and they took action to fill that gap, even though it wasn't part of the traditional remit of their agency. They took the role of the other. They took the teaching role, going beyond the grant-giving role, which was their traditional model. And so, taking the role of the other. And then, the third element of the model, boundaries. Boundaries are usually seen as defensive mechanisms. Keep the outsiders out. A firm competing against others traditionally differentiates itself and keeps itself apart from its competitors. Governments compete against each other. And universities, of course, do also. But boundaries have now to be reconceptualized, not only as defensive mechanisms, but also as integrative mechanisms, ways of including people and organizations from other spheres. And so this is why we have the growth of interface organizations and people who cross boundaries and bring other people across. Incubators, technology transfer offices, and science parks. All of these, if they're working properly, are ways of moving knowledge, people, ideas across boundaries. And so boundaries, therefore, have to be seen in a new way, not as exclusionary mechanisms, but as mechanisms for inclusion. The triple helix starts from many different standpoints in different parts of the world. In some countries, government has been the main institution, the overriding institution, which incorporates industry and academia. In fact, I first developed the triple helix as an explicit concept in a visit to Mexico, where I was invited by colleagues to help them organize a research institute on university-industry relations, which is how I first thought of the topic when I was doing research in this area in the States. But when I came to Mexico, you couldn't ignore the role of government. Government was everywhere. Government provided the framework for business, for universities. And so I thought of it as university, industry, government. The light bulb went off, and I began to call it a triple helix of university, industry, government relations, and saw as well that this is what I had really been studying in the States, where government is often hidden or even denigrated. But if you look deeply into what is happening between university and industry, you'll always find a strong role for government. Very often, the story of the foundation of Google is told in terms of two guys who met during the orientation of new students in the computer science department at Stanford University. But a paper that was presented, a joint paper from a Swedish university and a Google staff person, shows clearly that if you look at the origins of Google from a triple helix perspective, you'll see that it came out of a government program, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, data mining initiative, which established research centers at a number of universities in the States, including Stanford. Hundreds of millions of dollars of government funds provided to develop data mining. This provided the support for these two graduate students who were working on this data mining research project as part of their PhD program. And so it was out of that government-supported program and the remit of that program that led them to the algorithm that became Google. And of course, it was also the context and the entrepreneurial university tradition at Stanford that helped move that idea and gave them the idea to transform it into a company. But the background, research, and basis for that firm came out of government-funded research. So the statist model is one model in which government leads the other spheres. France, China, Singapore are all examples of a government-pulled triple helix. Singapore, for many decades, saw itself as a manufacturing country, taking outsourced businesses, producing disk drives for manufacturers in the United States. But at some point, the business disappeared, and they were left without an economy. And moving in a top-down way, heretofore they had told their people to become obedient workers. Now they turned on a dime and said, we now want you to become scientists. They started establishing science fairs, encouraging students to become entrepreneurs. 15 years ago, I gave a talk on the Entrepreneurial University at the National University of Singapore, invited by a particular academic who was interested in the theme. He was the only one at the university at that time who was interested in the topic. And some of the administrators from the university were there. And after my talk, they said to me, what you're saying is very interesting, but it has nothing to do with us here at the National University of Singapore. We're here to prepare an elite to take up positions in government and large organizations in Singapore. A few years later, the National University of Singapore rebranded itself as an entrepreneurial university and moved into this new role and now sees itself as having this mission. And then by 2006 hosted the Triple Helix Conference in Singapore, having made this transformation. And so the statist Triple Helix is one model, top-down, led by government. At the opposite pole is the laissez-faire model, university, industry, government, far apart. Only sporadic interactions through intermediaries. This is the model by which the states is said to operate. But in reality, it's an ideological model. It's not how the states actually operates. I always say to colleagues elsewhere, don't listen to what people from the United States tell you about innovation. That it's all the heroic entrepreneur who takes the lead and does everything. In reality, government is very strongly involved, and organizations are very strongly involved. And in fact, entrepreneurship is rarely an individual phenomenon. It's always a group and collective phenomenon, but it often becomes hidden because one person is focused upon in later publicity. Like Steve Jobs became the hero of entrepreneurship. But if you look at the founding of Apple, there was another Steve Wozniak, the engineer who was educated at De Anza Community College in Silicon Valley. He had the technical expertise to put together these components, which were newly available, into a new configuration. That was his innovation. And Jobs put an attractive plastic case on it and was the salesman. But these two guys, with the technical concept and the sales expertise, they couldn't get the firm off the ground by themselves. It wasn't until they recruited a third person, who's almost totally forgotten in the story of Apple, Mark Merkula, an experienced executive from the semiconductor industry, who retired early at the age of 35. But he was brought into the firm And he gave them credibility to suppliers and sales outlets, so that these two young guys could then move forward as the firm. It wasn't until the third person, the third element of experience, came into the picture that the firm actually began to take off and do business. And so entrepreneurship is a collective phenomenon. In countries with a collective and group culture, such as Scandinavia, this is explicit. And in fact, in those countries, the individual isn't willing to move forward on their own. It's only when they have the group behind them that they will take a step to do something new. And so at Gothenburg University and Chalmers University in Sweden, the master's program in entrepreneurship, you apply as a group with your idea for a firm and the relationships already worked out. And you go through the program as a group and graduate as a firm. Of course, some of the ideas don't work out, but the people have learned something from the process, and they may try again. But there, it's explicit that entrepreneurship is a group process. And so, it also doesn't have to be seen as something needing the one individual, because that in reality is not how entrepreneurship actually takes place. It's the formation of the group with a balance of skills. And this became especially clear in a recent project that's been organized at Stanford University, which is often thought of, and is, the world's leading entrepreneurial university. But in reality, only a small portion of the potential of the university for entrepreneurship has been realized. In 2005, I spent a year as a participant observer in the university's technology transfer office. And at the end of the year, I was invited to give a talk to all the members of the office. And I told them, you're doing a great job, but you're only operating on one cylinder of your potential. Even though you have 25 people working in this office, you only have the potential or the ability to deal with Stanford's serial entrepreneurs, professors who have done firms many times. You don't have enough capacity to deal with the people, the professors and students who don't have this background, who may have good ideas for companies, but don't know how to take it forward. So your offer to introduce them to a venture capitalist is meaningless because they don't know what to do with this offer once you make the introduction. But Stanford has believed that the university itself is the incubator, so it has no explicit incubation process. Now, this thesis that I made in the abstract, it's difficult to prove just on the basis of the analysis. Each year, the funding goes up that the transfer office brings in. If you tell the administration that there's a problem, they'll look at you with disbelief. The idea is that if it's not broken, don't fix it. My idea, if it's working well, make it work better. 2 years ago, students at Stanford in the student government, students knew that they didn't have the knowledge and skills to form successful companies by themselves. It would be very unusual for someone like a Mark Zuckerberg to do this. These are the exceptional cases. But students who were trying to do this at Stanford were facing great difficulties, and they knew they needed help. And so it was a sociology master's student and some of his friends from the student government at Stanford organized SSE laboratories. Basically, an accelerator project. They recruited alumni from Stanford from high-tech firms in the area and from the venture capital firms to mentor and coach the student firms. They established a vetting process in order to take groups of students and qualify them and select them for going through this process, and then graduating them at the end of the academic quarter with a demonstration day. I went to the first demonstration day a year ago. A few days ago, I went to a second one. I thought when I went to this event, there would be small things organized by students. What I saw was projects of a much larger scale than I expected. Because while a student was always involved, the students going through this training process were representing the entire research group of a Stanford laboratory. Not just the students, but the professors, the postdoctoral students, the research associates. These were firms that were emanating from the research programs at Stanford. That 50 years ago, the university encouraged to incubate in the laboratories. And the same at MIT. But over the past 50 years, these universities have moved away from encouraging entrepreneurship in the university's laboratories. They have said that this should move out of the university. The university should be separate from the entrepreneurial process. I learned from a friend who is director of business development at Boston University one reason why this idea spread. The notion of the legal concept of inurement, which I hadn't heard of before. But it means that if you're a non-for-profit entity under United States law, if you engage in more than 10 or 15% of business activities, you could place your not-for-profit status at risk. So the university lawyers advised the administration to be very careful, to keep entrepreneurship separate. And so, whereas 50 and 60 years ago, the leadership of these two universities encouraged incubation of firms in the university laboratories, today it's discouraged. And you have to move outside the university. In Brazil, in 2004, the innovation law that was passed there and also in France legalized forming of firms in the university's laboratories. It didn't say you had to do it, but it made it legal, and those universities that wanted to didn't then have to worry about consequences, that they were violating the rules of academic procedure. And so up-and-coming universities took advantage of this and started attracting professors from the universities that didn't want to go in an entrepreneurial direction, because they could then combine organizing their research group and a firm as one entity with two streams of funding. Funding from the research agencies for the research work, and then funding from venture capital or from the government development agencies for developing the commercial aspects. And so if you visit the 4G firm at the Pontifical University of Rio Grande do Sul, it's the same people in the same entity in the University Science Park that are running the research group and the firm. It's a quasi-firm. It's a firm in a laboratory in a firm. We need a new concept to denote this hybrid entity. But that is now what's encouraged in Brazil and France. So the laissez-faire model, in which the university often initiates triple helix interactions, but is often precluded by legal restrictions and entities from actually cooperating too closely. And until recently, firms were also held back by antitrust laws, which have now been loosened and allow the concept of open innovation to come forward, where firms collaborate as well as compete with each other. And so, whether it's from a statist starting point or a laissez-faire starting point, my argument is that we're moving towards a common model of university, industry, and government still having their own independent roles and identity, but also converging towards each other. And it's at that space of intersection that new creative ideas come up. Because people from different perspectives interacting with each other are more likely to invent, and not only invent, but have the resources from their different spheres to implement the new idea. When I started doing research on university-industry relations, I sent in a paper to the sociology meetings. I'm a sociologist by background, although I'm now in the field of innovation studies. And I got back a letter from a distinguished historian and sociologist of science, Joseph Ben David. He said to me, I accept your paper, it's fine, but how can you study this topic without looking at the history of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology? I had to agree and got some funding from the Humanities Endowment to go to the History of Science department at Harvard to study MIT. And when I was at Harvard, they said to me, why are you always going to MIT? You're at Harvard. So I had to explain to them that I was here to study the origins of the phenomenon of university-industry relations. And it was in the president's papers at MIT that I found letters and discussions going back to the 1920s, in which an organization had been established in the New England states, led by the governors of New England, who called together the public and private leadership of the region. But given that it was New England, which has a very high concentration of universities, they could not ignore that. And so they invited the academic leadership to come into this organization, the New England Council, which was established to redevelop the economy of the region, which was already in depression before the 1930s. Its industries had moved to other parts of the country to be closer to sources of raw materials and lines of distribution. And so they had to reinvent the economy. And implicitly, they were operating on it as a triple helix. They first tried all of the common ways of economic development that we're still familiar with today. FDI, foreign direct investment, trying to attract branch plants from other parts of the country. So they sent a delegation to Detroit, but no one was going to establish an automobile plant in Boston, too far away from raw materials and lines of distribution. So that idea couldn't work. The next idea was to raise the level of the local SMEs, the small and medium-sized firms. But in this case, their analysis was that these firms were too far behind to be able to revive. They were still making implements out of whalebone in the plastics era. And it was in this context that the president of MIT, Carl Compton, made a new suggestion. Percolating around MIT and Harvard from the early 20th century, firms had been formed, first in scientific instruments, in order to develop and market instruments to other universities. And then in the 1920s, in the radio industry, from new developments at the university. And the idea had been percolating among the administration at MIT to establish a research row of firms along the Charles River to systematize this process. And Compton proposed that to this organization in the mid-1930s. He had actually already proposed this at the national level. He had been called to Washington to be head of a science advisory board to propose solutions to the depression of the 1930s. But in the context of the 1930s, the idea of using science for economic development was too radical to be accepted. At that time, the general idea was that science was the cause of the Depression. Too much science and technology, too many labor-saving devices, putting people out of work. And so his ideas were not accepted at the national level. The report that he wrote was never actually published, and that Science Advisory Board was disbanded. So when he went home to New England and put these ideas forward in this local context, where they could already see examples of firms being founded from science coming out of MIT and Harvard for 20 and 30 years, and the old ideas didn't work, the business and government representatives took up this idea, and they made an analysis of the region. They had the funds, but it was tied up in banks and insurance companies that were lending to large corporations that had no experience or even the legal ability to lend to small, risky ventures. And so they had to change the laws in order to allow the banks and insurance companies to invest a small proportion of their funds in new ventures. Today, of course, we're a long way from the prudent, so-called prudent man rule of limiting risky investments of these organizations. But at that time, it was very difficult to do that. And they also knew from their analysis that while a few professors were forming firms, most did not have the background or experience to do that. And so these firms would need both seed capital and business advice. And so they came up with a plan for a new type of organization, which we now know of as the venture capital firm. And the first venture capital firm was founded in 1946, the American Research and Development Corporation, as a coalition of MIT and the Harvard Business School. MIT provided graduates as scouts to find the technologies in the university laboratories to make into firms. Harvard Business School provided graduates to provide business advice and mentoring of those firms. And at that time at Harvard, today a large percentage of Harvard graduates want to become entrepreneurs. And as was mentioned by the previous speaker, they do so after 15 years. But at that time, there was one professor who was interested in entrepreneurship, Georges Doriot, who had come to the United States from France, who had been a general in World War II in the Quartermaster Corps, basically to bring new innovations into the armed forces. He became president of ARD in his spare time as a professor. And it took more than 10 years before they had their first success, which was the Digital Equipment Corporation, which became the basis of the mini computer industry in Boston. That industry long disappeared, but the background that was established of forming firms from academic research, government programs in the state of Massachusetts to support that, the government research programs at the federal level, laid the basis for the next wave of development, which has been the biotechnology industry, which then has attracted large pharmaceutical firms to locate next to MIT and Harvard today. And whereas the mini computer industry moved out to the suburbs and isolated themselves from the universities and from new ideas, which was one reason for their demise. They didn't take up new ideas in personal computers, and so they disappeared. But the biotechnology industry is staying very close to the universities, locating across the street, and keeping close ties to academic laboratories. So that is the next wave of development in Boston. And the base of this triple helix model, it's more than university, industry, and government. The base is a democratic civil society where all elements of the society have the opportunity to provide input and ideas. A top-down model can do great things very quickly, but if there's only one source of ideas from government, what if the wrong choice has been made or not the optimum one? Very difficult to change. Singapore made that change. But if you look at what's actually operating there today, it's government-supported research institutes that have hired scientists from abroad. And much of the research that Singapore is supporting flows back to the countries where those scientists come from. There's only one person in Singapore that has the right to free speech and criticism, the daughter of Lee Kuan Yew. And she has criticized the institutes for that reason. And her words have been publicized, but she's the only one who has the ability to criticize in that country. And so therefore, the institute model has become institutionalized, even though it does little to promote actual economic development in Singapore, but it's helping Scandinavia more than Singapore, because that's where the ideas are going to, because they're relevant to those countries' research. So, the ideal triple helix is where there's leadership from all spheres and all levels, not just top down, but bottom up, as in the Brazilian model of the creation of the popular cooperative movement. National, state, and local governments with innovation agendas and agencies. Universities of all types moving towards an entrepreneurial regime. And then this process legitimated by the national government. Today in the United States, the Obama administration put a lot of money into basic research in the stimulus package 2 years ago. 2 years later, they realized that they needed to do more than that. They needed to also support commercialization. But by that time, they had no ability to get further laws or funds passed. And so there's now President Obama's webinar series, in which the universities that know a little bit mentor and give talks to the universities that are further behind. National government wants to move in this direction, but it's limited in what they can do. But when one level of government is limited, and the state governments are out of money, laying off employees, so the first thing to go is the funds for the innovation agency. And local governments are even worse off. So it was in this context that the student government at Stanford took the lead in developing this new entrepreneurship model, which has just received a grant of $800,000 from the Kauffman Foundation to spread the model further. And so it's not only great amounts of money that are useful. The university is also a key institution because it has flexible resources and time of its faculty and students that can be put towards new efforts. So it can be creative from the bottom up if people decide to move in this direction. And so at Stanford, it was students taking a leave of absence from their studies that organized this accelerator project. And they convinced the America Online firm to give them free space in the AOL building across the street from Stanford. The firm is shrinking. So plenty of space in their building. No problem for them to give it. And there's lots more space like that in other corporations in the university's research park. If you visit the Hewlett-Packard buildings, you'll find they're almost empty because most of the firm's engineers are now in India. So plenty of more space. That's not the problem. But people often think when they come to visit Silicon Valley and Stanford, they see the beautiful buildings in the science park, and they say to themselves, this is what we should have, from President de Gaulle to President Medvedev. And they go back and they start large-scale building projects. But it's not the buildings that create knowledge-based economic development. It's the people and the encouragement of the projects that do it. But this is a very difficult lesson to teach when people want to do something very quickly. And so another aspect of the model is the triple helix spaces: knowledge space, consensus space, and innovation space. The spheres, university, industry, government, look at the lateral relationships. The spaces look at these developments over time. Knowledge, of course, is the pool of existing and new knowledge that's available, not only in universities, but also in industry and government. And the question is how to utilize that. In Mexico, all the knowledge was bottled up in Mexico City in research institutes. But in the 80s, in response to earthquakes, they began to decentralize the research institutes. And when some of them moved to new areas, they asked themselves, what can we do to apply our knowledge to the problems of the local area? And they began to come up with ideas, working with local actors in their regions. And so this decentralization of knowledge incentivized its use. And so the consensus space then are the fora, the bringing together of people from the different spheres in meetings such as this, in organizations like the New England Council, or in Amsterdam, an organization that brings together representatives of university, industry, government to brainstorm ideas for their economic development. The formal and informal networks that come out and start new developments. And then after the consensus space, the innovation space, the role of leadership, what I call the regional innovation organizer, whether it comes from university or industry or government. In New England, it was government that took the leadership. In the downturn in Silicon Valley in the 90s, it was the companies who called the academic and government leadership together into joint venture Silicon Valley, and they brainstormed ideas and came up with plans to focus on networking technology, which became the basis for the revival of Silicon Valley at the end of the 90s. And so the Entrepreneurial University is an outcome of these developments. It's what I call the second academic revolution. The first revolution was the incorporation of research into the university as an academic mission, in addition to teaching. The second revolution is the incorporation of entrepreneurship into the university as an academic mission. And this, as I've said before, is a nonlinear model. It can start from a teaching base as well as a research base. You don't have to go through the history of academic development, going from teaching to research to entrepreneurship. You can go from teaching to entrepreneurship. Or you can take a research institute that's underutilized and add a teaching element onto it, as is being done in many countries in Africa and in Latin America, to make new universities. And so the researchers become teachers as well, much more productive use of resources. That's in fact how the land-grant university was invented. In the state of Connecticut in the 1830s, the farmers wanted research. They believed in scientific agriculture. And so the government started an experimental farm. But then they wanted their children to be trained in scientific farming. And so they started the college to do that. But they couldn't afford to do both. So they put them together in one entity. And that was the beginning of the land-grant model, which was then spread throughout the United States in 1862. And I always wondered, why 1862? Why was the Morrill Act creating a land-grant university in each state? Why was that law passed in 1862? What else was going on at that time? The Civil War. The slave states, which were a very conservative element in the country, had left the Union. And at that point, new ideas, new laws could be passed. That's why it happened in 1862. That this model, which was invented in the 1830s, was then generalized throughout the country in 1862 and became the basis for the development of the Entrepreneurial University model. Well, as you've already said, the university has this bi-evolution from individualistic to a group focus, not only in research, which we now see of as consisting in the sciences, but increasingly in the social science and the humanities as research groups, rather than the dyadic relationship of professor and student. And teaching, not only in classrooms, but in incubator facilities, training groups to work together as organizations. And in economic and social development. Typically, when a university comes up with a new idea, it first begins to think of becoming entrepreneurial when someone comes up with an idea for a patent and it wasn't done in time. It's the fish that got away. And they then decide to move in this direction. But over time, the university usually thinks of playing a broader role, not just focusing on an individual technology, but thinking about what it can do to help the economic and social development of the region where it's located. And that's when it becomes a triple helix actor and engages with the other elements in the society. And so this is the realization of President Compton's vision in the 1930s, a vision which has waned at MIT now and is in need of revival, waned even at Stanford, where the group of students who formed the StartX Accelerator recently met with the president to convince him to organize an incubator for biotechnology firms. For 15 minutes, he argued with them, saying, there's no need for this. We have all the resources here in Silicon Valley. He told them how he had formed his firm in computer science with venture capital funds and experienced entrepreneurs. But eventually, the students convinced him that although they themselves had overcome the obstacles to successfully form their firms, this could be made much easier if the university made available underutilized space, underutilized laboratories in academic buildings. And we all know in the university that departments hoard space because they know they'll need it in the future. And sitting there, underutilized, at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, they wanted to build an incubator. But the state of New York wasn't ready to give them the money. So instead, they started the project in underutilized laboratories. And 5 years later, when the state was ready to give them the money to build, and they built the incubator, they could move these firms from all over campus into the incubator, and the project was a success from day one. If they had built the building first, they wouldn't have firms to move in. And 2 or 3 years later, people might have said, this is a failure. You have an almost empty building, and shut it down, which is what often happens. That's the fallacy of thinking of the building project first. And so circulation of individuals across the triple helix spheres is a key to improving creativity and linkages among university, industry, and government. And to realize this model, at a traditional university, I was for several years at the University of Newcastle in the UK. And so I've experience with the British academic tradition, where you have universities today rebranding themselves as entrepreneurial universities, like the University of Plymouth calls itself now an entrepreneurial university. But at the same time as it calls itself that, the business school rejected a proposal to form an entity to do community outreach, believing that this did not fit with the traditional model of the university. So there can be a gap between the branding effort and what's actually being done on the ground. At Newcastle, they were, at the time I was there, the vice chancellor was a successful biotechnology entrepreneur. But lower down in the university, when young faculty members would come to me with saying that they were interested in forming a firm, but they dare not mention it to their colleagues. Because if you actually formed the firm, you'd have to give up your position in the university. And that's a pretty big step to take. You couldn't take a leave of absence as you could do in the States to do this. And so I proposed to them to institute a professor of practice model, taking it from the teaching model in the States, but making it a research-based model to attract to the university PhDs who'd formed successful high-tech firms, to be role models within the university. And every department knows these people, but there's usually no role for them in the university. The professor of practice created the role, half-time. Stay in the firm half-time, be in the university half-time. And these people came up with new ideas for projects within the 3-year period that they had. And so the professor of practice model is one way to reorganize the professorial role. So my thesis is that when at least 20% of faculty are professors of practice, then we'll have an entrepreneurial university. And not only by bringing people in from industry and government, but also it's a way of having people go out from the university, but not having to leave completely. Stay with a significant role in your firm, and then stay in the university half-time. Recently, a leading faculty member at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology resigned. He had formed a firm, but he also wanted to keep up his academic role. But it was not possible to do that within the 1-day-a-week consulting rule. He wanted 50% of his time to be with his company and 50% in the university. But the university was too rigid to make this accommodation. And so they lost a leading professor. There was nothing they could do within their traditional model to retain him. A professor of practice model, half-time, as a way to go out and to bring people in. And as a senior person moves out half-time, you can then hire a junior person on the other half of their salary. And so it's a way of expanding the university. And after I had done this, the communications department came to visit me. And they said, we wished we had heard about this model when we were hiring. Because if we'd used this model, we could have hired a much higher level of persons from the communications industry if we could have offered this half-time role. So it's not only relevant to the sciences and engineering, but also to other disciplines across the board. And it's actually already a model that you'll find in the arts. At the school I taught at, all the professors of the arts and music, they were all pursuing artistic and musical careers, at least on a half-time basis, even though there was no official provision made for it in the rules. That's how the school actually operated. So, institute the professor of practice model is one structural step towards reorganizing the university into an entrepreneurial university. The next step is to transform the curriculum, the undergraduate curriculum of the university. When I first arrived at Newcastle, they asked me to organize a grant proposal to the European Union and the US Department of Education to give out a joint degree, a European degree and an American degree, which of course, as we know, are too far apart. US degree very open-ended, the European degree very narrow. So after much thought and experimentation, I came up with a model that went down the middle. A tripartite degree, which I called the Novum Trivium, after the classical trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. But the Novum Trivium is a traditional discipline, whether it be engineering or music or history or whatever, and then training in entrepreneurship and innovation, how to put your ideas into use. And the third element, training in a language and culture in addition to your own, because many students will be working in other parts of the world or working with people from different cultures, even if they stay in their own country. So language and culture, in addition to your own, as the third element. In many universities you can find at least two of these elements, but all three together become the Novum Trivium, a model for undergraduate education in an entrepreneurial university. And then the PhD degree. We know that at best, 15% of PhDs will now find employment in an academic setting. But that's still what we train them for, even though that's not going to be the destination for most of them. I was at a conference like this in Lusaka, Zambia, a few months ago. And my co-leader of the conference, Professor Calestos Yuma, from the Kennedy School at Harvard, commented to the meeting that the modern form for the PhD was 3 published articles. I thought for a few seconds, and then I said, but the model of the PhD degree for an entrepreneurial university should be 2 published articles. And the third element should be a piece of research carried forward through the translational process, through a prototype, or even to a firm. That should be the model of the PhD for an entrepreneurial university. And recently, I was meeting with the students, the PhD students in biotechnology, who were preparing for a meeting with the president of Stanford. And they told me that many of them had taken leaves of absence, and they were complaining that at Stanford you could only take a 2-year leave of absence, whereas at Berkeley you could have a 3-year leave of absence. I told them there should be no leave of absence. You should be able to do your firm formation as part of the PhD degree. And they all agreed that would be wonderful. But it will be a while before that's taken on board at major universities. It's up to the new universities that are coming up to take the lead in transforming the structure of education so it meets the needs of teaching, research, and entrepreneurship. But the elements are all there. You can find examples of everything I've talked about at some university somewhere in the world. They all need to be synthesized into this working model. And so that's the triple helix. And finally, the commercial. We're holding a workshop at Stanford, 12th to the 16th of November, on building the Entrepreneurial University. At the Triple Helix International Conferences, we primarily have academic researchers, although there are also always policymakers from government and from firms. But this workshop is focused on the practitioners with the leading ideas for innovation of the university to move it in an entrepreneurial direction. So I have some brochures at the front table, and I encourage you to send a delegation from Trinidad and Tobago and to join us at Stanford. Because it'll be a way not only of learning about these latest developments, but also of making a connection to Stanford and to Silicon Valley. Thank you.